The dust kicked up in lazy spirals as the stagecoach rolled to a stop outside Jeremiah Hawthorne's ranch house. The weathered rancher adjusted his hat and squinted through the afternoon sun, his heart hammering against his ribs like a woodpecker on old oak. After 3 months of correspondence with Miss Charlotte Fairweather of Kansas City, she was finally here. His mail-order bride, the woman who would help him turn his sprawling cattle ranch into a proper home. What stepped down from that dusty coach, however, was not what Jeremiah had expected. First came a vision in yellow calico, blonde hair gleaming like spun gold beneath a matching bonnet. She moved with the grace of a dancer and the confidence of a woman who knew her own worth. Behind her emerged another blonde beauty, this one in sky-blue cotton, slightly shorter but with the same refined features and intelligent green eyes. And finally, a third woman descended, older, dignified, with silver threading through her golden hair like moonbeams, wearing deep burgundy silk that spoke of Eastern refinement. Jeremiah's mouth fell open like a barn door in a windstorm. "Mr. Hawthorne, I presume?" The woman in yellow extended a gloved hand with a smile that could charm the bark off a tree. "I'm Charlotte Fairweather. I do hope you don't mind, but I've brought my family along for the journey." "Family," Jeremiah managed to croak, his voice dry as the Arizona desert. "My sister Margaret," Charlotte gestured to the woman in blue, who curtsied with a mischievous twinkle in her eye, "and our dear mother, Elizabeth Fairweather." The older woman stepped forward with the bearing of a queen. "Mr. Hawthorne, I do hope our presence isn't an inconvenience. Charlotte spoke so fondly of your letters that Margaret and I simply couldn't resist seeing this frontier paradise for ourselves." Jeremiah felt like a man who'd ordered one horse and received an entire herd. He'd prepared his heart and his home for one woman, not 3 golden-haired angels who looked like they'd stepped from the pages of a fairy tale book. "No inconvenience at all, ma'am," he finally managed, remembering his manners. "You're all welcome at the Circle H Ranch. Though I confess, my accommodations might be a mite humble for such refined ladies." Charlotte laughed, a sound like silver bells on a summer breeze. "Mr. Hawthorne, after 3 days in that bouncing contraption they call a stagecoach, I assure you that anything with a roof and walls will seem like a palace." As they gathered their trunks and parcels, Jeremiah found himself stealing glances at all 3 women. Charlotte was everything her letters had promised. Intelligent, kind, with a spark of adventure in her eyes that had drawn him to her correspondence in the first place. But Margaret possessed a quick wit that showed in every gesture, and Mrs. Fairweather carried herself with a dignity that spoke of strength forged by years of frontier life. "Pedro," Jeremiah called to his foreman, a weathered Mexican man who'd worked the ranch for nearly a decade. "Help the ladies with their belongings." Pedro Martinez approached with his hat in his hands, his usual stoic expression melting into one of wonder as he beheld the 3 blonde beauties. "Si, Señor Hawthorne. Welcome, señoras, to the Circle H." As they made their way toward the ranch house, Charlotte fell into step beside Jeremiah. "Your letters didn't mention how beautiful this country is," she said, gesturing toward the rolling hills dotted with cattle and the mountains rising purple in the distance. "It's so vast, so free." "It can be lonely too," Jeremiah admitted. That's why I wrote to you. And I'm glad you did." Charlotte's voice held a warmth that made his chest tight. "Though I hope you're not overwhelmed by our little family invasion." Before Jeremiah could respond, Margaret piped up from behind them. "Don't worry about us, Mr. Hawthorne. Mother and I are quite capable of making ourselves useful. I've been tending our own garden for years, and Mother could organize a cattle drive with one hand tied behind her back." Elizabeth Fairweather chuckled. "Margaret exaggerates, but we're not hothouse flowers, Mr. Hawthorne. The frontier bred us, just as it bred you." The ranch house, while sturdy and comfortable, suddenly seemed impossibly small. Jeremiah had built it for a bachelor, with plans to expand once he had a wife. Now, looking at it through the eyes of 3 refined women, he saw every rough board and simple furnishing with embarrassing clarity. "It's not much," he began, but Charlotte cut him off with a raised hand. "It's honest," she said simply. "It speaks of a man who builds for necessity, not vanity. I like that." The next few days passed in a whirlwind that left Jeremiah feeling like he'd been caught in a cyclone. The Fairweather women transformed his simple ranch house with their presence, bringing warmth and life to corners that had been silent for years. Charlotte proved to be everything he'd hoped for in a wife. She rose before dawn to help with breakfast, learned the names of every cowhand on the ranch, and showed genuine interest in the cattle business. When she stood beside him on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jeremiah felt a contentment he'd never known. But Margaret was a force of nature unto herself. While Charlotte learned the rhythms of ranch life, Margaret threw herself into improving everything she touched. Within 2 days, she'd reorganized the kitchen, started a herb garden, and somehow convinced the most stubborn bull on the ranch to eat from her hand. "That animal's been ornery since the day he was born," Jeremiah told her as he watched the massive beast docilely accepting apple slices from her palm. Margaret grinned. "Everything just needs the right kind of attention, Mr. Hawthorne. Even stubborn bulls." And then there was Elizabeth. While her daughters adapted to ranch life, the older woman seemed to simply absorb it, as if she'd been waiting all her life to return to this kind of existence. She could read weather patterns like scripture, had opinions about cattle breeding that proved surprisingly astute, and possessed an uncanny ability to settle disputes among the ranch hands with nothing more than a level look and a few well-chosen words. "Your mother's quite a woman," Jeremiah told Charlotte one evening as they watched Elizabeth mediate an argument between 2 cowhands over a card game. "She had to be," Charlotte replied. "After Father died, she raised Margaret and me on her own, kept the farm running, and still managed to give us an education. There's nothing Mother can't do if she sets her mind to it." As the weeks passed, Jeremiah found himself in an increasingly complicated situation. He'd fallen in love with Charlotte through her letters, and meeting her in person had only deepened those feelings. She was intelligent, kind, and possessed a strength that would serve her well as a rancher's wife. But he couldn't deny that Margaret's vivacious spirit and Elizabeth's quiet wisdom affected him as well. The problem came to a head on a Tuesday morning when rustlers struck the south pasture. Jeremiah rode out with his men, leaving the women at the ranch house with instructions to stay safe. When they returned that evening, tired and frustrated after losing a dozen head of cattle to the thieves, they found a surprise waiting for them. Charlotte met them at the door, flour dusting her apron and pride shining in her eyes. "We thought you might be hungry," she said, leading them into the dining room where a feast waited: roast beef, fresh bread, vegetables from Margaret's garden, and apple pie that smelled like heaven. "The ladies, they work all day to prepare this," Pedro explained, accepting a plate with reverence usually reserved for church. "Like magic, they make everything appear." But it wasn't just the meal that amazed Jeremiah. While he and his men had been chasing rustlers, the 3 women had transformed his house into a real home. Curtains hung at the windows, rugs covered the rough floors, and somehow they'd managed to acquire furniture that made the place look like something from a catalog. "How did you?" he began, but Elizabeth held up a hand. "Charlotte organized it, Margaret provided the labor, and I supervised," she said with a smile. "We may be city-bred, Mr. Hawthorne, but we're not helpless." "I sent word to town this morning," Charlotte explained. Mr. Patterson at the general store was more than happy to extend credit to the future Mrs. Hawthorne. The words hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. Mrs. Hawthorne. He'd been so enchanted by the presence of all 3 women that he'd almost forgotten the original purpose of Charlotte's visit. She was here to marry him, to become his wife and help him build a life on the frontier. That night, as the house settled into quiet, Jeremiah found himself unable to sleep. He sat on the porch, staring at the stars and wrestling with feelings he didn't fully understand. Charlotte was everything he'd wanted in a wife. So why did the thought of choosing her, of saying goodbye to Margaret's laughter and Elizabeth's wisdom, fill him with such unease? "Mind if I join you?" He turned to find Elizabeth approaching, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the desert chill. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, making room on the porch swing. "I never could when there were important decisions to be made." Elizabeth settled beside him with a sigh. "And I suspect you have some important decisions ahead of you." Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment. "Your daughter's a remarkable woman, Mrs. Fairweather. Charlotte, she's everything she promised to be in her letters, and more." "Yes, she is." Elizabeth's voice held a mother's pride. "But that's not what's troubling you, is it?" "I don't rightly know what's troubling me," Jeremiah admitted. 3 weeks ago, I knew exactly what I wanted. Now I feel like I'm trying to lasso smoke. Elizabeth chuckled. I remember feeling that way once, when I first met Charlotte and Margaret's father. He was so different from what I'd expected, so much more complex than the simple farmer I thought I was marrying. Love isn't always as straightforward as we'd like it to be, Mr. Hawthorne. Love. The word escaped before he could stop it. You're a good man, Jeremiah. May I call you Jeremiah? You have a good heart, and good hearts don't always follow the paths we set for them. Elizabeth reached over and patted his hand. The question isn't whether you love Charlotte. The question is whether you love all of us. The words hung in the night air like smoke from a campfire. Jeremiah felt his chest tighten as the truth of them settled into his bones. Is that even possible? He asked quietly. On the frontier, we learn to expand our definitions of what's possible, Elizabeth replied. The heart is like this land, Jeremiah, bigger and more generous than we ever imagine. The next morning brought visitors. Jeremiah was mending fence in the north pasture when Pedro came galloping up, his horse lathered with sweat. Señor Hawthorne, there is trouble at the house. Jeremiah's blood turned to ice. The women. They are safe, but there are men, 6 of them, maybe more. They say they come for the señoritas. Jeremiah didn't wait to hear more. He spurred his horse toward the ranch house, Pedro keeping pace beside him. As they crested the hill, he could see the riders, rough-looking men on tired horses, circled around his front porch like vultures around carrion. But what he saw when he got closer made his heart swell with pride. Charlotte, Margaret, and Elizabeth stood on the porch, showing no sign of fear despite being outnumbered. Charlotte held his old Winchester with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it, while Margaret brandished a cast-iron skillet like a weapon. Elizabeth simply stood with her arms crossed, radiating the kind of authority that could stop a stampede. What's the meaning of this? Jeremiah demanded as he dismounted, his own rifle in hand. The leader of the group, a scarred man with tobacco-stained teeth, spat into the dirt. No trouble here, Hawthorne. Just came to collect what's ours. Nothing here belongs to you, Garrett, Jeremiah replied, recognizing the man as one of the rustlers who'd been plaguing the territory for months. That's where you're wrong. Garrett's grin was unpleasant. See, those 3 yellow-haired beauties? They belong to my boss now. He's willing to pay handsomely for 'em. The words ignited a fury in Jeremiah's chest. These ladies are under my protection. You'd best ride on while you still can. Garrett laughed. 3 against 6? I don't like those odds, Hawthorne. 7 against 6, came a voice from the porch. Charlotte had stepped forward, the Winchester steady in her hands. And I guarantee you that the first man who makes a wrong move will be picking buckshot out of his hide. 8 against 6, Margaret added, hefting her skillet. And this pan's seen enough action to know its business. 9 against 6, Elizabeth said calmly. And I've buried 2 husbands and raised daughters on the frontier. Don't mistake my age for weakness. Jeremiah felt a surge of admiration for the 3 women. They stood like warriors, united and unafraid. But before he could respond, the thunder of approaching hooves filled the air. Pedro had returned with 6 ranch hands, all armed and ready for trouble. The rustlers suddenly found themselves outnumbered more than 2 to 1, with 3 deadly determined women holding the high ground. Garrett's confidence evaporated like morning dew. This ain't over, Hawthorne, he growled, but he was already backing his horse away from the porch. Yes, it is, Elizabeth said in a voice like steel wrapped in velvet. And if you or your friends ever threaten my family again, you'll discover just how creative a frontier woman can be with a shotgun and a good cause. The rustlers rode off in a cloud of dust and muttered curses, leaving the ranch in blessed quiet. Jeremiah turned to the 3 women, his heart overflowing with emotions he couldn't name. Are you all right? He asked, though he could see they were more than all right. They were magnificent. We're fine, Charlotte said, lowering the rifle. Though I think this proves we're tougher than we look. Speak for yourself, Margaret grinned, still holding her skillet. I've always known I was tough. Elizabeth simply smiled. It takes more than a few unwashed rustlers to intimidate a fair-weather woman. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table sharing the story of their victory over the rustlers, Jeremiah realized something fundamental had changed. These weren't three separate women anymore: Charlotte, his intended bride, Margaret, her sister, and Elizabeth, her mother. They were a family, and somehow, without his quite understanding how it had happened, he'd become part of that family. After dinner, Charlotte asked to speak with him privately. They walked out to the corral, where the horses dozed in the warm evening air. "Jeremiah," she began, and he could hear uncertainty in her voice for the first time since she'd arrived. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Always," he replied, though his stomach clenched with worry. "Do you love me?" The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. "Yes," he said truthfully. "I do love you, Charlotte. You're everything I hoped for and more." She nodded slowly. "And Margaret?" Jeremiah's throat tightened. "I care for her deeply. She's like family to me. And Mother? I respect her more than any woman I've ever met," he admitted. "She has a strength that humbles me." Charlotte was quiet for a long time, staring out at the darkening hills. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but sure. "I love you too, Jeremiah. From your letters, I knew you were a good man, but being here, seeing how you treat your workers, how you care for this land, how you've welcomed not just me but my entire family, you're better than I dared hope for. But—" he could hear the word hanging unspoken in the air. "But I can't marry you." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Charlotte, if I've done something—" "You've done nothing wrong," she interrupted, turning to face him. "You've been perfect, which is exactly the problem. You see, Jeremiah, I've been watching you these past weeks, and I've realized something. You don't just love me. You love all of us, me, Margaret, Mother, each in your own way. And we all love you too." Jeremiah felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "What are you saying?" Charlotte took his hands in hers. "I'm saying that traditional marriage might not be the answer for people like us. We've all found something here on this ranch, something we didn't even know we were looking for. Margaret has found purpose in her gardens and her work with the animals. Mother has found a place where her strength and wisdom are valued. And I've found a home and a man worth sharing it with. I don't understand. What if we didn't have to choose?" Charlotte's eyes shone with an idea that was as radical as it was simple. "What if we all stayed? Not as husband and wife in the traditional sense, but as a family. A partnership." Jeremiah stared at her. "People would talk." "People always talk," Charlotte replied. "The question is whether we care more about their opinions or our own happiness. It wouldn't be conventional." Charlotte laughed. "Jeremiah, nothing about this situation has been conventional from the moment 3 women stepped off that stagecoach instead of 1. We're frontier people. We make our own rules." Before he could respond, Margaret and Elizabeth appeared from the direction of the house. Margaret was grinning, while Elizabeth wore an expression of motherly concern mixed with determination. "We couldn't help but overhear," Margaret said without a trace of apology. "And before you say anything, Jeremiah, let me speak my piece." She stepped forward, her green eyes blazing with conviction. "I never expected to find a place like this, where I could be useful and valued for who I am instead of who I might marry. You've given me that, whether you meant to or not. And Charlotte's right, we do all love you, each in our own way. I love you like the brother I never had," she continued. "Someone I can trust, someone I can count on, someone who makes me feel safe and cherished without any of the complications that come with romantic entanglement." Elizabeth stepped forward next. "And I love you like a son, Jeremiah. Like the man I always hoped my daughters would find but feared didn't exist. You're honorable, hard-working, and kind. You've given an old woman a place of respect and purpose when the world told her she was past usefulness." Jeremiah looked at the 3 women, so different, yet united in their affection for him and their desire to stay together. What exactly are you proposing? A partnership, Charlotte said. We all contribute to this ranch. We all share in its success. Margaret manages the household and the gardens. Mother oversees the domestic operations and helps with the business side, and I learned to be a rancher alongside you. And the sleeping arrangements? Jeremiah asked, his face burning with embarrassment. Elizabeth chuckled. We're not suggesting anything improper, son. Charlotte can have the master bedroom, Margaret can have the small room, and I'll take the room off the kitchen. You can keep the bunkhouse room you've been using since we arrived, at least until we can build some additions to this house. But what about romance? Marriage? Children? Jeremiah's voice cracked slightly on the last word. Charlotte blushed prettily. Those things can develop naturally, if they're meant to. We're not closing any doors, Jeremiah. We're just not forcing ourselves through ones that don't feel right yet. Margaret nodded enthusiastically. And who knows? Maybe someday you'll meet a nice woman in town who catches your eye, or maybe I will meet a cowboy who sweeps me off my feet. But for now, this feels right. This feels like home. Elizabeth smiled. The frontier teaches us that families come in all shapes and sizes, Jeremiah. What matters isn't what people expect, but what works for the people involved. Jeremiah looked at each of them in turn. Charlotte with her intelligent eyes and generous heart, Margaret with her irrepressible spirit and practical nature, Elizabeth with her quiet wisdom and unshakable strength. They were offering him something unprecedented, something that defied convention but felt more right than anything he'd ever known. People really will talk, he said finally. Let them, Charlotte replied. We'll be too busy building something beautiful to care. The ranch hands might not understand. Pedro already told me he thinks we're the best thing that ever happened to this place, Margaret grinned. And if the others have a problem with it, they can find work elsewhere. The townspeople will adjust, Elizabeth said firmly. Frontier communities are more accepting of unconventional arrangements than you might think. As long as we conduct ourselves with dignity and contribute to the community, they'll come around. Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing through all the implications, all the possibilities, all the ways this arrangement could succeed or fail. But when he looked at the three women standing before him, united in their determination to create something new and wonderful together, he felt a peace settle over him like morning sunshine. Well, he said slowly, I guess we'd better start planning those additions to the house. The next few months passed in a blur of activity and adjustment. True to their word, the three women threw themselves into making the ranch not just profitable but genuinely prosperous. Charlotte proved to have a head for business that rivaled any man Jeremiah had met, negotiating deals with buyers that left everyone satisfied. Margaret's gardens expanded until they were providing vegetables for half the county, while her way with animals turned their breeding program into the talk of the territory. Elizabeth, meanwhile, became the unofficial den mother to every cowhand within 50 miles. She settled disputes, provided medical care when needed, and somehow managed to turn the roughest ranch hands into respectful gentlemen in her presence. The townspeople did talk, as expected, but curiosity proved stronger than disapproval. When the Fairweather women appeared at church every Sunday, dressed respectably and contributing generously to community causes, criticism gradually gave way to acceptance. I heard Jeremiah Hawthorne's got 3 wives now, old Mrs. Patterson whispered to her friend at the mercantile. Don't be ridiculous, Ethel, came the reply. It's perfectly respectable. It's his wife and her family. Lots of frontier families live together like that. Well, his cattle certainly look healthier than they ever did when he was a bachelor, Mrs. Patterson admitted grudgingly. And it was true. The Circle H Ranch flourished under the combined efforts of the unusual household. Cattle grew fat and healthy, the vegetable garden supplied the growing demand from town, and the ranch house became a social center for the scattered community. On warm evenings, they would all sit on the expanded porch, for Jeremiah had indeed built those additions, creating comfortable spaces for everyone. Charlotte would read aloud from books ordered from back east, Margaret would work on her needlepoint while sharing the latest gossip from town, and Elizabeth would tell stories of her younger days on the frontier. Jeremiah found himself more content than he'd ever imagined possible. He had the companionship he'd craved, the help he'd needed, and something he'd never expected, a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. Romance did develop, as Charlotte had predicted, but in ways none of them had quite anticipated. Jeremiah and Charlotte grew closer gradually, their mutual respect deepening into something richer and more complex than either had experienced before. There were stolen kisses in the barn, long conversations under the stars, and a growing certainty that their unconventional arrangement was leading toward something beautifully traditional. Margaret, meanwhile, caught the attention of the new schoolteacher, a young man named Daniel Wright who appreciated her intelligence as much as her beauty. Their courtship unfolded slowly, with Daniel becoming a regular visitor to the ranch, drawn as much by the warm family atmosphere as by Margaret's charm. "I never expected to find such happiness in such an unusual situation," he confided to Jeremiah one evening as they sat on the porch watching Margaret teach Elizabeth's latest rescued kitten to fetch. "Life has a way of surprising us," Jeremiah replied. "Sometimes the best things come in packages we never thought to order." Elizabeth, for her part, seemed to bloom in her role as the family matriarch. She formed a particular friendship with Pedro's wife Maria, and together they created a network of support for the other ranch families in the area. Her quiet authority and practical wisdom made her a sought-after mediator for disputes and a trusted advisor for young couples starting their own frontier families. As autumn painted the hills in shades of gold and crimson, Jeremiah realized that his mail-order bride experiment had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He'd ordered one wife and received a family. He'd sought companionship and found love in 3 different forms: romantic, sisterly, and maternal. He'd hoped to ease his loneliness and instead had created a home that drew people from miles around. The official wedding took place on a crisp October morning, with the local preacher performing the ceremony under the cottonwood trees beside the creek. Charlotte wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slender frame, while Margaret served as maid of honor and Elizabeth gave the bride away. But even as he spoke his vows to Charlotte, Jeremiah knew he was really pledging himself to all 3 women, to the family they'd created together, to the life they'd built from nothing but hope and determination. "Do you, Jeremiah Hawthorne, take Charlotte Elizabeth Fairweather to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher asked. "I do," Jeremiah replied, his voice strong and sure. But in his heart, he was also saying yes to Margaret's laughter, to Elizabeth's wisdom, to the unconventional family that had become the center of his world. The reception was held on the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns strung between the trees. The whole county seemed to be in attendance, drawn by curiosity but staying for the genuine warmth and hospitality that characterized everything the unusual household did. As the evening wound down and the guests began to drift away, Jeremiah found himself standing on the porch with his 3 favorite women, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. "No regrets?" Charlotte asked, her hand finding his. "None," he replied honestly. "This is exactly what I wanted, even when I didn't know what I wanted." Margaret grinned. "And to think, if you just ordered a normal bride, you might have gotten some quiet little woman who would have faded into the background. Instead, you got 3 loud, opinionated, stubborn women who've completely taken over your life," Elizabeth added with a chuckle. "Best decision I ever made," Jeremiah said, pulling Charlotte closer while reaching out to include Margaret and Elizabeth in the embrace. "Though I still can't believe you all fit in that one stagecoach." "We're very efficient packers," Charlotte laughed, "among our many other talents." As they stood together under the vast western sky, surrounded by the ranch they'd built together and the love they'd discovered in the most unexpected way, Jeremiah reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. He'd been a lonely bachelor, desperate enough to send away for a bride he'd never met. Now he was a husband, a brother-in-law, a son-in-law, and the patriarch of a family that defied every convention but worked better than anything he could have imagined. The frontier had taught him that success came in many forms, that families could be built as well as born, and that love was big enough to encompass far more than he'd ever dreamed possible. When he'd ordered a bride, he'd gotten 3 golden hearts that had transformed not just his ranch, but his entire understanding of what it meant to be truly wealthy. And as the desert wind carried the scent of Margaret's roses and the sound of Elizabeth's contented humming, while Charlotte's head rested against his shoulder and her ring caught the starlight, Jeremiah knew that some mail orders delivered exactly what you needed, even when it wasn't what you'd requested. The Circle H Ranch had become more than a cattle operation. It had become home to a love story as wide and generous as the western sky itself, a testament to the truth that the heart, like the frontier, was always bigger than anyone imagined.